all-new Sonic 3D Blast for Sega Saturn, Sega Genesis, and Game Gear.
Hello everyone, I'm Tyler, and welcome to another episode of Player One Start.
In this video, I'm actually going to continue talking about Sonic 3D Blast, only this time for the Sega Saturn. If you want to see my video on the Genesis version, go ahead and click the link that should be popping up now in the corner. Otherwise, let's get started.
And to tell you the truth, the Sega Saturn's kind of weird. Let's go ahead and take a look at one game on the Sega Saturn. As early as 1994, STI began working on what would become known as Sonic X-Treme for their next-generation console, eventually named the Saturn. At the time, Sega of Japan and Sega of America ran as separate entities, and relations were not always smooth. Some of this conflict may have been caused by Sega president Hayao Nakayama and his admiration for Sega of America. According to former Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske, there were some guys in the executive suites who really didn't like that Nakayama, in particular, seemed to favor the US executives. A lot of the Japanese executives were maybe a little jealous, and I think some of that played into the decisions that were made. By contrast, author Stephen L. Kent wrote that Nakayama bullied American executives, and that Nakayama believed the Japanese executives made better decisions. Development of this game began with Yuji Naka's return to Japan with his team in late 1994. STI was left mostly with American staff. Early ideas for the next Sonic game included the experimental Sonic Crackers, which became Knuckles Chaotix for the 32X. Sonic X-Treme was originally conceived for the Sega Genesis as a side-scrolling platform game like most Sonic games. As new consoles of the 32-bit era were on the way, the game was moved to the 32X under the working titles Sonic 32X and Sonic Mars, after the Project Mars codename for the 32X. The initial design was for an isometric side-scroller, but became a full 3D game with a view set on a floating plane. The game itself had completed its design documents for the 32X version before the 32X version was released, without a clear picture of what the hardware would look like. In mid-1995, the game's team leader and executive producer resigned from the project. According to some, the executive managers of the project were not getting along. Later that year, amidst a redesign of the game, another project manager also left the project and was replaced. This change in leadership led to some struggles between the lead programmers of the project and the executive producers in charge. All the while during that time, when the 32X was released and was a commercial failure, the game was again going to be redesigned to another Sega cartridge console that would be based on an NVIDIA 3D hardware chip to compete with the upcoming Nintendo 64. Again, development continued without any foreknowledge of what the hardware would be capable of when they released the game. And when Sega of Japan announced that Sega would focus solely on the Sega Saturn, development shifted again. The Saturn version was developed by two teams with two different game engines, starting in the second half of 1995. One team focused on developing the free-roaming boss levels. This engine used tools used by Saturn games such as Panzer Dragoon, and rendered bosses as fully polygonal characters. The other team developed the main levels. They began working on the PC with the intent of porting their work to the Saturn. By the end of 1995, everyone was feeling frustration towards the structured environment that was set up, as well as the increasing friction in the political environment among the staff and employees. On top of that, game development was running into hiccups as well. Among other difficulties from the design, the basic theme of the game was to take a 2D Sonic game and add the ability to have him go in and out of screen. On paper, that sounded like a good idea, but when it actually started to be implemented, the addition created some design challenges that they couldn't account for. 3D graphics were also new, and developers were still learning how they would affect controls and gameplay. As programming for the Saturn proved to be difficult, most of the engine was developed on Windows. Getting it to work on the Saturn was another challenge altogether, and was outsourced to a third party. All development of this game came to a head in March of 1996, when Sega of Japan representatives visited STI to evaluate the progress. Long story short, the demo that they had created was not optimized yet to run on the Saturn, and ran at a very poor frame rate, which left the representatives very unimpressed with the work. However, they did like the boss engine, which was running very efficiently at the time, and they suggested that the game be reworked around that engine. STI was now tasked with almost overhauling the entire game. In May of 1996, Sega displayed a playable demo of Sonic X-Treme at E3. Though when it became clear that the game would not meet its deadline of the 1996 holiday season, Sega instead concentrated on Sonic Team's Nights into Dreams and a port of the Genesis game Sonic 3D Blast by Traveler's Tale for the Saturn. Sega did put out a statement saying that X-Treme had been delayed, but in early 1997, they announced that it had been cancelled altogether. This left Sonic 3D Blast as the only official Sonic game for the Sega Saturn, which many to this day still credit as one of the main reasons why the Sega Saturn failed.
So this is crazy. Sega decided to license Sonic for its own main game to another developer. That's kind of huge, I think, and something I actually didn't realize happened when I first played this game back in 1996. Even though that huge Traveler's Tales logo pops up, it didn't sink in. Wait, this game wasn't made by Sonic Team. So that's strange in itself, but the game that Sonic Team was working on, when Sonic Team ran into issues developing that game, instead of fixing it or just not releasing a game, they decided to port Sonic 3D Blast to the Saturn. And again, that's a little backwards from what I would think. I would think that it would start on the Saturn and be ported to the Genesis, just based on the timeline. So anyway, let's go ahead and compare the gameplay of Sonic 3D Blast from the Sega Genesis to the Sega Saturn.
As expected, the Saturn version has a more detailed and longer FMV to start the game. The title screens are very similar, including the options menu you get when you first boot up the game. To cover up the newly added loading times, there is a map showing you Flicky Island. So the game does look very similar, but you can tell that there is a lot more detail on everything, and there are a lot more objects on the screen. I like that the bridge tilts because it makes the otherwise static area seem a bit more interactive. And here's a direct comparison between the Genesis first level. You can tell the level is laid out exactly the same way, but the graphics have a major update. Let's go ahead and check out the bonus stages. And wow, this is very visually impressive, and this is what I would have expected Sonic 3D Blast to look like on the Saturn. Let's just compare this to the Sega Genesis version. So they've gotten away from the pseudo 3D environments and actually built a fully polygon-rendered real-time 3D environment. This is very impressive, and I think this is part of the game's downfall because this points out what this game should have been. Everybody was expecting Sonic X-Treme, and unfortunately, since this game wasn't that, a lot of people were disappointed going right into it. Everything else throughout the rest of the game is exactly like the Genesis version, only with updated graphics and sound. Again, this is mainly a port of the game, so it's not meant to be a sequel or have much different to it. With that said, let's go ahead and just take a sneak peek at what some of the other levels look like compared to the Genesis version. So that is crazy, that the only Sonic platforming game that ended up being released on the Saturn was this game, and they never released Sonic X-Treme. And to make matters worse, the only 3D Sonic level we would get would be a hub world for a Sonic compilation disc of the original Sonic games on the Saturn. Unfortunately, I don't have that game to showcase to you because it is insanely expensive. Maybe someday I'll find it cheap, but I'd really like to explore that 3D Sonic level that showcased what might have been on the Sega Saturn. The next game I'm going to showcase is actually going to be on the Sega Dreamcast, again bypassing another spin-off for the Saturn, which was Sonic R. I may come back again and do that someday, but I'm really trying to focus on the main Sonic games. So stay tuned for the next video in this series, which will be Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast. Until then, that'll about wrap it up for this video. Remember, if you like what you see, please hit that like and subscribe button, share with a friend. If you'd like to help support future projects on this channel, please see the link to Patreon below in the description. Again, I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Also, if you enjoy the content of this channel, please remember to click on this subscribe button. Again, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. If you'd like to see some of the content I've already done, feel free to click on some of the suggestions that are popping up on your screen. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.